Everywhere you go, including on channels like mine that's critical of the CCP, you hear one thing. China's growth has been impressive. 10% growth for years on end. No matter the size of the economy, that's impressive. But do it in a country of 1 billion plus people? That's nothing short of a miracle. But what if I told you that the CCP has fooled everyone, including me? Their greatest feat isn't their miraculous growth, but rather having everyone believe that they have had miraculous growth.
China's rise has been something of a miracle.
This announcement comes as China's GDP grew by
4.5% in the first quarter of the year.
After 3 years of widespread COVID-19 curbs, China's economy
grew 4.5% year-on-year between January and March,
beating analysts' expectations.
Consumption and retail sales rose in the world's second largest economy.
So let me just first explain how this all started. Just last month, China released its GDP numbers, and surprising to the whole world, it was announced that China's economy grew 4.5% year-on-year, which was much higher than what everyone was expecting. According to a Reuters poll, most experts expected the economy to grow only 4%, while the IMF kept cutting its forecast of China's GDP growth regularly. So it's really surprising that the official numbers are much higher than everyone's expectations. Can China be lying about their numbers? I mean, it's not like the CCP has a history of lying, do they?
Where ethnic Uyghurs, most of them Muslims, have been unlawfully detained and mistreated.
What's surprising is the government isn't reporting many deaths.
我们坚持人民至上，生命至上。
Before jumping on, a quick reminder to like the video. My last video, I forgot to ask for your likes, and the video was throttled by the algorithm. And this just proves that your likes make a huge difference in how my videos perform. So please take a second and leave a like below. Let's first look at the history real quick. China's GDP has grown tremendously. There's no doubt about that. You can look at this chart here. But we have to ask ourselves the most important question. Who is counting this GDP? We're not going to fall for the stupid saying numbers don't lie, because in reality, numbers most definitely lie. But sometimes you just have to dig deeper to find that lie. You see, in China, GDP numbers are calculated and published by the local governments and the CCP. There's a big problem here, and to truly understand the issue, first let me explain how GDP calculation works here in the USA. For us, there's an independent federal agency called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or the BEA, that calculates and publishes all economic data, including the GDP numbers. Now here's the true importance of this setup. We all know politicians love talking about their GDP numbers, whether it be in the US or in China. If things are going good, they love taking credit. And if things are going bad, they love deflecting blame. Basically, GDP numbers are very important to people in government positions. That's why the BEA is an independent agency, so that politicians can't affect the calculations of the GDP numbers. Additionally, politicians' policies do have an effect on the GDP, but the BEA can do little to nothing to actually affect the GDP. Let me explain. I'm sure you guys probably already know this, but here's the simplified GDP formula. GDP equals the sum of consumptions, investments, government spending, and net exports. That means when politicians pass a budget to build a new bridge or a highway, it's part of the GDP. But that GDP is calculated by the BEA, so politicians can't fake the numbers or lie about how much it is. And on the contrary, the BEA has no power to pass any bills to actually increase or decrease the GDP. All they do is calculate what the economy has produced. Good old checks and balances, right? The same checks and balances that are missing in China. Which makes sense, considering it's a one-party nation with totally legit elections.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping
has just been elected president of China
as China's head of state
and chairman of the PRC Central Military Commission.
And his nation is on the rise.
And a near unanimous vote, with 99.86% of the vote.
Won by 2,952 votes to 1.
I wonder what happened to that one guy who voted against Xi. Anyway, you get the point. The CCP has all the power in China, and there's no one who is beyond their reach. There is no such thing as an independent agency for anything, let alone for economic data. Additionally, China's economy doesn't work like the US. And no, I'm not talking about the communism stuff. Here in the USA, we measure how much the economy has grown, but in China they announce goals and how much they want the economy to grow. Which doesn't sound like that bad of an idea until you start digging deeper. Beijing sends out annual goals to local leaders of each province in China. Then these local leaders are responsible for achieving these goals. Theoretically, they're supposed to do this by, attracting businesses, promoting entrepreneurship, improving infrastructure, and several other ways you can see here on the screen. But the problem is sometimes these don't always work. The economy naturally goes through peaks and troughs. But in China, that's not an option. You see, politicians' careers are dependent on hitting or even exceeding the target set by the CCP. Promotions are based on how well your region does. Worse yet, sometimes missing GDP goals can mean penalties like demotions or even dismissal. So, officials are highly motivated to make sure they provide results by any means necessary. Of course, that includes lying. But I will get into how lying has gotten Chinese officials in deep trouble, but first, let's go over the easiest way to hit GDP goals, and that is government spending. If you guys recall our GDP equation from before, GDP is equal to consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net export. Easiest way a government official can increase GDP is just approve more and more government spending. And that's exactly what so many Chinese officials have done. But unlike the USA, the central government doesn't provide funding for local governments to spend in China. The CCP sets the targets, but local governments are on their own when it comes to funding. Worse yet, tax dollars actually just go to Beijing. So that means the local governments have to get creative when it comes to raising money for local projects. I have talked about this extensively in my previous videos, but one big way local governments would raise money was by leasing out land to developers. So, if you think about it, governments were directly benefiting from the real estate bubble. The more money a developer can borrow, the more they could bid on lands, thus helping local governments raise more money. Now, we already know that the China property market is slowing down, and to make sure the country doesn't collapse because of debt, the CCP had set 3 red line policies for property developers. But since the CCP's 3 red line policy, the revenue for local governments has dropped drastically, which puts some of them at risk of default. Technically speaking, local governments can't borrow money. So to get around this rule, they would set up companies called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs, which allowed them to sell bonds and borrow money. And since these LGFVs were owned by the government, investors assumed they were relatively safe bets. But they aren't as safe as people would assume. So here's how the government loans work in theory. As long as the money is used to create economic output that's more than the interest on the loan is a success. But that's where the problems start. Local governments aren't just borrowing money to improve their local economy. They are borrowing it to artificially prop up the GDP numbers so that they can achieve the goals set by the CCP. I always go back to this simple example to explain the workings of government loans. Let's say you're in a village and your government borrows money to build a railway line to connect the village to a city. Now, money spent on that railway line counts towards the GDP, and it's a great use of government spending because residents of the village can easily, get a job in the city because commute times are now shorter. Now, what if next year the government borrows money again and builds another train line, just like that one, because the spending counts towards the GDP, right? I'm sure all of you can see that this is a very dumb reason to borrow money, even if it increases the GDP in the short term. Now, I will admit, this is a very simplified example, but in reality, a lot of local governments in China are doing exactly this, just at a more complicated scale. They would borrow money just to prop up the GDP numbers in the short term. They're not worried about long-term ramifications of these loans because as long as they hit the CCP's targets, officials will get their promotion, and the future will be somebody else's problem. So remember this. Chinese local governments are over-leveraged, and some are very close to bankruptcy. We will talk about the effects of this later in the video. Now, let's talk about another way local officials increase the GDP numbers, and that's by just straight up lying. You know how I said in the beginning, officials are the ones reporting the GDP numbers to the central government in Beijing, and then the CCP publishes it to the world. Sometimes local officials just increase the reported growth numbers arbitrarily, since there's no agency to verify the numbers, and there's no checks and balances in place to deter this from happening. Crazy part is that the CCP even knows this. The CCP Premier, which is one of the highest ranks in the CCP, has told other countries that China's GDP numbers are man-made because of this issue. They know this is going on, but they're not too focused on fixing it because high growth makes the CCP look good. Even if the CCP wanted to fix this, the effects would be catastrophic. Since this has been going on for roughly 2 decades now, the fake numbers have compounded. You see, lying about a few basis points isn't a big issue to fix. But if you lie one year, now you have to lie a little more next year, and then the next one, and so on, and by the end of it all, the reported number is extremely far off from reality. On top of this, no one has any incentive to really fix this. Why would the central government want to fix this? It only makes them look bad in front of the world and their own citizens. And why would local officials want to fix this? It could lead to serious penalties against themselves. And in the past, the CCP has shown that it is not afraid to use capital punishment against government officials. But this really does beg a question. How big is China's economy actually? And how strong is it in reality? Now, that's something that is impossible to figure out from the outside, especially for a small YouTuber like me. Luckily for all of us, there are a bunch of people much smarter than me who have tried tackling this question before. Let's get into that. There's a study done by Professor Luis Martinez, where he looked at many countries' GDP growth and their nighttime light intercity from satellite imagery. Based on this data, Chinese GDP growth over the past 20 years may have been about a third slower than reported each year, leaving its economy significantly smaller than that of the USA. Now, this study mainly focuses on GDP growth, and if you want to read all the details, you can easily find it online. But Dr. Yuri Skasfut from the channel Money and Macro actually used data from the study to roughly calculate the actual GDP of China, and the results were kind of shocking. Again, I want to reemphasize these are rough calculations. It's impossible to get exact data because of the way the CCP operates. But according to his calculations, China's actual GDP is 60% smaller than what the CCP reports to the public. Yeah, you heard me right. 60% smaller. If you want to learn more about his calculation, definitely check out his video. But let's just assume China's real GDP is somewhere around 60% less than reported. That means the debt they have is astronomically higher than anyone has ever realized. Remember earlier we talked about how local governments loved borrowing money using LGVF? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about government debt because of the issues we have with our own national debt. But one argument most people usually make is that our debt isn't that high, if we consider that our GDP to debt ratio is relatively small when compared to other nations. If we apply the same argument to China, we can see the true scale of the problem. The Chinese government loves taking on debt and continuously lies about their GDP. So their debt to GDP ratio is extremely high. I'm sure that the heads of the CCP are already stressing out over the debt time bomb that is ticking faster and faster. And only time will tell how it will play out for China and the CCP.